Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
Richard Pulcher of Lublin is a Democratic candidate in the 29th Senate District. Mr. Pulcher, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Well, thank you.
What do you consider the top one or two issues in your campaign for the Senate, sir?
Well, one of the first ones is 10% of our kids can't pay attention in school because they're hungry. That should be an easy fix. We should just be able to take care of it. Another one is 20% of our transportation budget is spent on interest to the bonds that they've already sold.
Right.
That's over $500 million. Now, Scott Walker is talking about not raising taxes or lowering taxes. You can't walk away from a debt like that. If you indeed lower taxes, you're going to have to pay for it soon.
Well, let's talk about transportation funding. How would you like to pay for the state's highways in the future? How if it were up to you?
Well, most of my information comes from a MacGyver Institute paper.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of things we can do. Is we can obey the state's laws on tracking the money and stuff like that. Also, Wisconsin has 19 revenue streams that go into transportation. We could take a close look at all of them and see which would be the most equitable and whatever. We can't have a state without roads. I'm not saying that. And if we have to raise taxes, that's actually lowering them in the long run. If I could give an example.
Please.
In 1998, I took over the Lublin Sewer Department. The sewer was put in 1980, and everybody thought it was a 20-year loan, and we were going to have it paid off in 2000, and then we wouldn't need to have a sewer bill. Well, that's kind of strange thinking, but that was what people were thinking, is that we wouldn't have this debt over our head. Well, I dug in to our papers and found out it was a 40-year mortgage, and at the end of that 40 years, there was going to be a balloon payment.
Oh.
And also, at the end of 40 years, we were going to have our lagoons dredged, and we'd have all 40-year-old equipment. Well, I explained that to the board, and for a while I couldn't have been elected dog scraper up of dog shit. But the village board took the bull by the horns.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing they did was they refinanced the loan through our local bank at a lower interest rate. And then, as the main employee, I went without a raise for several years. And we aggressively paid down the debt. We raised the sewer rates modestly. Well, after a while doing that, the village had enough money in their reserves to pay off the sewer debt.
Yeah.
So they did. Well, then the sewer owed money to the village, but the village can't charge interest.
Mm.
And in 2013, we were debt-free. And since then, we've been adding to our equipment replacement fund. Now we have over $40,000 in our equipment replacement fund. We have no debt, and things are very good.
Well, is the lesson here that we need to raise gas tax, the registration fee, consider tolling to pay down our transportation debt, Mr. Pulcher?
The lesson is we have to face it, and we have to decide to fix it.
Are you ready to raise the gas tax or the registration fee?
Well, according to that MacGyver Institute paper, instead of, they were talking about $1 billion deficit, but according to that paper, only $300 million would be the deficit. And that could be covered with a 5-cent gas tax hike.
Okay.
And there's 18 other revenue streams that could go into it. I think the important thing is you just have to say, this is a problem, we have to fix it.
Okay. You mentioned the number of children that come to school hungry. Is this an issue of better funding, more state aid for our public schools?
It could be, but schools are already trying to deal with that by giving breakfasts and stuff like that.
Yes.
One of the things that kind of bothered me a few years ago is they quit teaching home ec in school. A certain amount of this can be helped by simple gardening and home economics, where people coming out of high school know how to bake a cake, they know how to grow a garden, they know how to, because income isn't the only thing about feeding yourselves. Now, when I was growing up, my folks didn't have a bunch of money to spend on food, but my mom had a big garden, and every once in a while we killed an animal. We were farmers, and we ate really well. And it was all organic stuff, which is terribly expensive nowadays, but we just couldn't afford the stuff in the store.
So different approaches instead of another big increase in state aid to our public schools?
Well,
Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
I'm saying both.
Okay.
There was an $800 million cut to public education a few years ago. And if you consider that the aid would have been steadily going up, there's a huge hole that has dropped in that.
Okay.
Now, the other issue is Act 10. Are you familiar with Act 10?
Absolutely. And you're a former Teamster steward.
Yes.
So you believe should we completely repeal Act 10, both sides of it, collective bargaining and that which required public employees to pay more for pensions and health care?
Well, the part that requires more for pensions and health care, that can be negotiable once the other part is repealed. Now, Act 10, it took away the public sector unions the ability to negotiate working conditions, which is as bad as the pay increase part of it. I don't think we would have had the problems at Lincoln Hills if the employees could have negotiated working conditions.
I see.
Now, the other thing is that we were limited to the rate of inflation in asking for a pay raise, which meant every year we were worse off than the year before. To me, that kind of legislation is something that I would never, ever vote for.
Okay. What about the growth of the voucher or the choice program? Do you support the choice and voucher program?
No.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. So you're saying it should be ended?
Yeah. Public schools are public schools. If you want to pay to have your kid go to school, that's your choice. But public schools should be there for everyone, and it should be the great equalizer. Now, if I might give another example from my past, when I was 20, I was able to watch, and I helped somewhat in North Minneapolis with the starting of an alternative school. And what they did is they brought in kids who are at risk and had one-on-one teaching plus counseling. And the students went at their own rate. And some of the problems that these kids were dealing with, you could understand why they couldn't concentrate in school. I know of one whose father killed his mother in front of him. Well, you can't go through something like that and go to school and study geometry. It's a no-brainer. And so that school is still operating, and it takes in kids who are at risk and offers the same thing. And nobody tries to go to that school, but it has college graduates, and most of its students get a high school degree. Plus, their citizenship skills are really enhanced.
Okay. What about levy limits that control property taxes on local government? Should we keep them, loosen them, or get rid of them?
Well, we should either loosen them or get rid of them.
Okay.
If people want to pay more taxes, they should be able to. You know, taxes is not a one-way street. You get something for what you invest. And if your community chooses to invest in something, they should be able to.
Okay. The tax breaks given Foxconn and the proposal, Kimberly-Clark wants the same tax breaks. If you had been in the legislature, would you have voted for either of those packages?
No.
Why?
I don't believe government should pick winners and losers. Government should pick the rules, should set the rules of the game, and make sure they are fair and equitable.
Okay. The UW system budget, we've had a freeze on resident undergraduate tuition for 6 years. Should that freeze be continued?
Well, you have to look at the entire situation. Are you going to lessen the quality of the education because of the freeze? Are you going to borrow to keep the quality of education because of the freeze? Actually, one of the things that Democrats are really in favor of is letting people renegotiate their college loans at a lower interest rate.
Yeah. A number of local governments will be holding advisory referendums on legalizing recreational and medical marijuana. What's your position on both those issues?
Pretty much in the middle.
Okay.
If people want it, they can have it. I don't. It's not a strong issue for me, but I do wonder if we legalize the medical use of marijuana, if we would lessen the opioid epidemic.
Epidemic, okay.
Yes. And I think we should be wide open for medical use of anything, of any plant.
Your campaign website talks about accessible health care. How can we protect and maybe expand health care in rural Wisconsin, Mr. Pulcher?
Well, make sure that we have strong communities. Every town used to have a doctor. Well, that has gone by the wayside. But we do have good physician's assistants, and we have a very much more reliable EMS system. I was an EMT basic for 7 years. That is much better than it was in the past. I guess the biggest thing is cost, and that gets into a whole different bailiwick.
Well, speaking of costs, have you heard from hospitals, nursing homes, medical providers that our Medicaid reimbursement rates are too low, and we may be approaching a tipping point where those low reimbursement rates would hurt health care provided under our Medicaid system? Has that issue come up as you campaign? Are they too low?
Well, I haven't heard it as I campaign, but I used to work at Clark County Health Care Center,
yeah.
And it's a big issue there, especially when we're negotiating a pay raise.
Mm-hmm. Okay. State government and Delta Dental have a pilot program that provides dental care for the low income in regional clinics. Are you familiar with that program at all?
I am not.
Okay. Have you heard from caregivers about an issue? The AARP estimates that 578,000 Wisconsin residents provide care for a family member or a neighbor. Would you support laws or rules that require hospitals to recognize and work with caregivers when someone they have been providing care for is hospitalized?
Yes.
Has that issue come up?
It has not come up, but yes, I would be in total agreement with that.
Okay. Differences between you and the incumbent you're challenging on November 6th?
Well, number one, I'd like to repeal Act 10. He voted for it. Number two, I would like to just take the bull by the horns and confront this transportation problem head on. And one of the things that really kind of bothered me was Enbridge, the pipeline company.
Yes.
They lobbied the Republicans in the legislature and got them to loosen our private property rights. And it's been a slippery slope for a while. Normally, only eminent domain could be used to take your land, and only for public purposes. Well, there was a Kelo decision where if a company was going to have something that was obviously good for the community, they could condemn the land through eminent domain. Well, that happened. It was a Kelo decision in the Supreme Court, and then the company changed their mind. And after the people lost their land, it was just deserted. The bad thing about private companies taking land through eminent domain is they can walk away from it through bankruptcy. And governments have declared bankruptcy, but it's a very difficult thing to do.
Any other differences with the incumbent?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that's enough.
That Supreme Court ruling you mentioned, was that a state or a federal?
That was federal.
That was a federal case.
And,
Okay.
and see, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that the government cannot seize our land without just compensation. Well, eminent domain was set up so that they could seize our land. And normally that was for freeways, for roads, bridges, infrastructure.
Public projects.
Yes.
Okay.
And somehow, through the courts, it has turned into now any for-profit entity can condemn your land through eminent domain. And that's how Foxconn got their property.
I see. Okay. Richard Pulcher of Lublin is a Democratic candidate in the 29th Senate District. The election is November 6th. Mr. Pulcher, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.